So you've spent your entire career studying biogeochemistry, the cycles of
Uh-huh.
nitrogen, carbon, phosphorus through soils, waters, and the atmosphere. So if a friend heard that word, biogeochemistry, and asks you what did you actually do or what do you do, how would you explain it simply in 1 to 2 sentences?
Yeah, that isn't easy to do. But
Yeah.
I study how we use the land and how that changes the cycling of nutrients that are important for plants and animals to grow. So the bio part is the plants and the animals. The geo part is it often involves the soil and the properties of the soil that help retain some of the nutrients or result in them being lost. And the chemistry is the part in which those different nutrients take on different chemical forms, which some of which plants and animals can use and some of which they can't. So you put all that together, you're studying how uh, the important nutrients that are necessary for life, all life, including humans, cycles through vegetation, through the soils, the atmosphere, the water, and how it changes its composition along the way.
Yeah. So a lot of people know about CO2 and methane but almost nobody knows about nitrous oxide. Why do you think that people should care and what does it actually do in the atmosphere?
Okay. Well, nitrous oxide is the third most important anthropogenic greenhouse gas, and a greenhouse gas produced by humans. And it also is involved in reactions that destroy the protective ozone layer up high in the atmosphere, in the part of the atmosphere we call the stratosphere. And that protects us from ultraviolet radiation. So N2O is really kind of a double whammy there, and that it contributes to both climate change as a greenhouse gas and to destruction of stratospheric ozone. It's important for us to figure out how we can reduce those anthropogenic emissions. And the biggest source is from agriculture. And that's because we need nitrogen to grow food. You have to have nutrients to grow food. And the human population has expanded to 8 billion, and it's going to continue to 9 or 10 billion. And hopefully, there'll be more and more people around the world that'll have good nutrition. So they're going to be demanding more nutritious food. So that means we have to mobilize nitrogen, whether it's fertilizers or compost or manure. We have to put it on agricultural lands to grow more food. And when you do that, a small fraction of it gets lost as nitrous oxide, again, through some biological processes that occur in the soil. And so it's important for us to understand that and try to figure out how are we going to grow enough food to nourish 8, 9, 10 billion people and not continuing to increase this greenhouse gas that's changing our climate and destroying the protective stratospheric ozone layer.
Hmm. So your team led the 2024 global nitrous oxide budget. So what, in plain language, I mean, you've told me a little bit about this, but what's actually happening right now with global N2O emissions and what's driving that rise?
Well, as I just said, the biggest factor is agriculture, but there are other emissions as well that I should mention. Two kinds of industry, the production of something that's called adipic acid, which is used to make nylon, and another thing called nitric acid, which is used to make fertilizers and munitions and also the adipic acid. And it turns out that those are actually would be fairly cheap to mitigate, to reduce their emissions. Not not zero cost, but relatively cost effective, relatively cheap compared to other ways of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, including methane and CO2 that you mentioned. So there's a number of activities going on right now to try to reduce the emissions from those industrial sectors. In fact, today I was just reviewing a paper from authors from China reporting on how much of their emissions are now from industrial emissions because China industry has grown so much. So there's learning more about that. But then the biggest challenge is to tackle the agricultural emissions, which are about two-thirds of total human-caused emissions of nitrous oxide.
Mhm. So recently you published a Nature climate change paper saying that industrial nitrous oxide can be cut today with existing technology affordably. And this is like a good news story as far as that's concerned. So why do you think it's not already happening at a mass scale?
Well, it has already happened pretty substantially. The only two adipic acid plants in the United States now are mitigating. There was one that until about 2 years ago it wasn't, but this thing called volunteer carbon markets, where certain companies pay money to make up for the emissions that they think that they can't reduce. And so they pay money for somebody else to reduce their emissions. And so some of that money has gone to reduce the emissions from this one adipic acid plant that was still operating in Florida that hadn't up until then been abating its nitrous oxide emissions. Europe has pretty much completely eliminated their nitrous oxide emissions. Germany has a program to help low and middle income countries reduce their emissions. China, frankly, is the one that has done the least, but it's starting to become aware of its issues and it has committed itself to reducing its nitrous oxide emissions by 2035. That's a little later than we'd like, and we'd like them to take a more ambitious approach, but they're starting to turn the corner on that.
Yeah, so you served as a Jefferson Science Fellow at the U.S. State Department. So I want to hear a little bit from you what it's actually like being the scientist in the room when this environmental policy gets made. Like, has anything surprised you about the system, how it works or how it does not work?
Well, I was very impressed by how my colleagues at the time at the State Department, of course, things have changed since then. I was there in 2022. How dedicated and hardworking they are, and they're all, very smart and very capable, but they're super, super busy. They're constantly responding to emails, requests from their bosses to write up a one-page summary of this or that or the other, and getting prepared for negotiations here or there or whatever. So many of them would say, we just don't even have time to stop and think. So what we want you to do, Eric, as a Jefferson Science Fellow, is to think for us. So, for instance, they at the time they were negotiating a treaty about plastics, and I didn't know much about plastics, but I could treat it just like any other biogeochemical cycle, just like nitrogen or phosphorus. I could look at where are the anthropogenic emissions, where is it flowing? Is it flowing down? Is it escaping out rivers? Is it going up into the atmosphere? And I could, study what literature there was, what publications there were, to try to summarize those and put them into a form that my diplomatic colleagues could easily understand relatively quickly. And so that was the task of trying to synthesize this body of information. First of all, find the information in the literature, try to synthesize it in as succinct and clear a way so that these very capable people could use it in the process of developing their positions on various negotiations, international negotiations that they were participating in. So it was a real eye-opener to see how that being done. I like to think I made at least a minor contribution to that process.
Yeah, so I recently, a few days ago, just interviewed a scientist that was in New Zealand who said that a lot of his science, at least in his country, translates to action only through court cases because a lot of the politicians there ignore the evidence. So you've worked from the inside, and do you think, at least in the US, is the scientist to policy gap as broken as it may be for other places, or does the inside look a little bit different?
Well, at the moment, I'm afraid it's very broken. The current government is essentially they're saying that climate change is a hoax, and they've essentially dismantled the science about climate change. We have increasing risk of fires, for example, forest fires in this country because the forests are getting drier and it's hotter, and yet the current government is dismantling the Forest Service laboratories that study forest fire and what causes them and why they spread and what's the best way to avoid them. So I'm afraid at the moment the science to policy pathway is very, very broken. It hasn't always been that way. There certainly are cases where It's important to have, non-governmental organizations, environmental organizations being ready to go to court if they need to enforce the law. And that has happened, and it's one important way. But there are other ways as well. And so there have been times we've been able to work closely with the various governmental agencies and make some real progress. So there's no one answer. I think it's sort of you need all the tools in the toolbox to try to figure out how to achieve good policy.
Hmm.
And also just people like you and me going to visit our representatives and telling them what's important to us is also really important.
Yeah, so on a scale from 1 to 5, 5 being the most urgent, how worried should the average person be about the nitrogen cycle and N2O, specifically over the next 10 years?
I guess I'd give it a 3.5 or 4. It's not like things are going to fall apart over the next 10 years, but we need to be making progress on it now because we can't wait to find solutions 10 years from now when there'll be, I don't know, 9 billion people instead of 8 billion people. And, where these areas in like the Gulf of Mexico that we call a dead zone, where there's so little oxygen because and there's a lot of death of fish and shellfish. Those kinds of areas around the world are growing. They're not decreasing. The concerns about stratospheric ozone and climate change, those are not decreasing. They're getting worse. So nitrous oxide plays an important role in all of those. And so we need to be paying a lot of attention to it. So I'd certainly put it above a 3. It's a big challenge. I'm the third child in the birth order in my family, and the nitrous oxide is the third most important greenhouse gas. So I'm aware of how number 3 needs to have advocates. So I think we need to definitely have advocates.
Yeah, I remember you were talking about this a few questions ago, but is there anything that a specific that a regular person that's not a scientist or a policymaker should be doing to make a real difference for the nitrogen problem specifically, but also for general climate, helping the climate?
Well, I'd say the most important thing is to be talking about it just like you are. I think what you're doing is great, raising awareness because the surveys show that the vast majority of people are aware that climate change is happening. They're concerned about it. They don't know exactly what to do about it, but they're kind of afraid to talk about it because it's kind of a social taboo to, be bringing up all kinds of, issues and problems all the time. And there is a small, well, a moderate sized minority that becomes very, vocally, what's the right word, vociferous in their opposition to talking about climate change. But we all need to be talking about it to each other. And even if we can't find common grounds that what's causing climate change, we can find common grounds on how important good quality water is and making sure we have enough water and making sure that forest fires don't destroy homes. And so we can find things that we can find common ground even with those people that we don't agree with. And then in terms of your own personal behavior, trying to find ways to um, use energy more intelligently, electrification of things from heating houses to automobiles to various ways that we use the energy. Also being cognizant of what we eat. I'm not suggesting that people necessarily need to become vegetarians. They can if they like, that's fine. But just be cognizant of what the things are you eat and how much you eat and make sure you have a healthy diet. And if you have a healthy diet, it'll probably be healthy for the planet too.
Hmm. Yeah, so I asked these last two questions to basically every scientist. And the first one is, who are one or two scientists that you think I should interview after you? They can be in your specific field or outside or
Well, there's a fellow that wrote a really interesting book. His name is Michael Grunwald. And gosh, I'm blanking on the name of the book. It's We're Eating the Earth or something like that. So he would get into this issue about, you were asking what can individuals do if you're concerned about what kind of diets we need, what kind of agriculture we need. He would be a very interesting person to talk to. It might be hard to reach her, but Catherine Hayhoe, saving us. She's a climate scientist who is a really good communicator about science. She is also an evangelical Christian, so it's kind of interesting, the interaction between science and religion. So she would bring a different sort of perspective. She's very much in demand as a speaker, but we all have soft spots for talking with students. So who knows? Maybe you could get her attention.
Yeah, I got one more question for you. I think I've gotten so many different responses for this one, but it's if every teenager on Earth had to hear one last sentence from you, what would it be?
I guess I would follow your advice that what and your actions. Make sure that your information is coming from good sources. And so yeah, I think that's pretty short and succinct. When whenever you're interested in any sort of decision you need to make, whether it's your own health, whether it's your opinion about politics or about the environment or whatever, just check and double check on your information sources to make sure that they're well informed and objective.
Yeah, well, that's all I have for you. I really appreciate you taking just a little time to talk with me today.